That night was not like ordinary nights. There was no dampness in the air, no cold, yet the stones of the church were soaked in sweat, as if the building itself sensed something approaching. Far from the church, inside an old house, a baby girl opened her eyes. She did not cry. With her very first breath, she looked around as if she already recognized the place. The midwife stepped back the moment she lifted the child and made the sign of the cross. The mother asked weakly what was wrong. The midwife said nothing, but the fear in her eyes was the kind that cannot be hidden once it has been seen. The baby was placed against her mother's chest, but she did not feed. Instead, she kept staring past her mother's shoulder into the empty space, as if someone were standing there. At night, the house began to change. The walls grew silent like those of a church. The wooden stairs creaked even when no one walked on them. 6 months later, one night, the mother came to the cradle half asleep and saw the baby sitting upright. Her lips moved, but the voice was not that of a child. "You did not close the door." The mother turned around. The door was shut, yet darkness beneath it seemed to be breathing. From that night on, the child began to speak, and every word fell as if it were centuries old. Whoever came to see her heard their most hidden truth. A prayer whispered beside a grave. A promise made in the dark. A presence that followed them wherever they went. People stopped coming. Silence thickened around the house. One night, the mother heard the child speaking to the ground. She was lying on the floor, her ear pressed to the stone, whispering, "Not yet, not yet, their bones are growing weak, but there is still time." The church's priest was called. He froze the moment he stepped inside. Without looking at him, the child said, "You heard it, but you chose silence." The cross slipped from the priest's hand. He told the parents that this child was a listener, and that whoever listens eventually becomes a door. Time passed. The child grew, but childhood never reached her eyes. In mirrors, her reflection moved a moment too late. Her shadow reached the walls before she did. At last, fear made the decision. The child was handed over to the church. Inside the church, she was taught silence. Head bowed, eyes lowered. But she never closed her eyes. She was listening. To the walls. To the ground beneath. To what slept under the altar. At night, the nuns began to hear voices calling their names, names that had not been spoken in years. One by one, the nuns disappeared. No signs were left behind, only cold air and the smell of extinguished candles. The nun who had once been a child began spending more time near the basement door. The door that was always locked now opened in dreams. One night, the ground began to groan. The church bells rang without hands. Crosses trembled on the walls. She lit a candle, but the flame did not rise. It bent downward, as if something had drawn in a breath. The door opened. Below was not darkness. Below were memories. Whispers. Everything that had ever been asked for and never fulfilled. The thing without a name began to move. The church held its breath and listened. "I am the listener," she said. "I am the door." The earth answered. When the sun rose, the church stood empty. No nuns, no priest, no voices, only deep marks on the altar, as if something had carved words into stone with its nails. Whoever listens is never alone. And now, when the night grows very quiet, if someone stops near an old church, they feel their name being called. A soft voice. Patient. Waiting. And if they listen, the church begins to breathe once more. The voice was soft, but it carried insistence, as if something had been calling for years and was finally certain it would be heard. Those living near the church dismissed it as the wind, but anyone who came closer felt the sound rising from within themselves, as though their own heart were reminding them of something long forgotten. Inside the church, where no one lived anymore, the smell of melted candles still lingered. The doors were closed, yet at night faint sounds came from behind them, like bare feet moving across stone. Whatever had awakened beneath the basement was not yet fully free. The door had opened, but the passage was still narrow. It needed time. And listeners. The nun who had been taught silence within those walls was no longer silent. She was not where people believed she had gone. She had become part of the church itself. Her presence spread through the walls, beneath the floor, into the wooden beams. When the wind moved, it sounded like whispering. When the bells swayed, another voice blended into their ringing. The first traveler who entered the church came only to look at the ceiling. The moment he stepped inside, the door closed on its own. In the darkness, he felt someone standing very close behind him. He turned, but there was nothing there. Then a voice breathed into his ear, "You made a promise. A promise he had never made to another human being. His knees gave way. When he stumbled back outside, his eyes were empty. He did not live much longer. Slowly, the church ceased to be just a place. It became an idea. A whisper. People dreamed of standing before its doors. Some woke with candle ash on their hands. Others woke with their own name echoing inside their ears. The thing beneath the church fed on memories. Every truth once buried in the heart, every prayer whispered in shame, every fear never spoken aloud gathered there. And the nun, she was the gatekeeper. The listener. The one who chose. One night, beneath a sky heavy with clouds, a new door appeared inside the church. It was not made of wood or stone. It was made of shadows. Behind it glowed a pale light that burned the eyes. Anyone who approached heard the sounds of childhood. A mother calling. A father's anger. The scream of their own heart. Outside the church, trees began to wither. Birds no longer came near. At night, the ground grew warm, as if something beneath it were breathing. The nameless thing began to speak, but not in a human tongue. It spoke through dreams. It walked through memories. People began to return. The same ones who had abandoned the church years ago. They said they were being called. One whispered, "I heard she will forgive me." Another said, "I heard she will end everything." But no one who entered ever returned the same. Inside the church, marks appeared on the walls, like claw scratches, far too large. Beneath the floor, a heartbeat quickened. The nun's voice was now clear. She knew every person who crossed the threshold. She touched the weakest place in their heart, and then she opened the door. One night, the entire church began to shake. The bells rang without stopping, as if time itself had been trapped. The door of shadows opened fully. What lay beneath was rising. It was not a body. It was a presence that completed itself by entering others. The nun whispered, "There are many listeners now. You may come." The stones of the church screamed. Old voices filled the air. Every prayer, every promise, every fear spoke at once. And in the middle of that chaos, the nun smiled. There was no human white left in her eyes. There was depth. There was a doorway. By morning, the church still stood, but its shadow had changed. Anyone who passed by felt as though something walked beside them. And at night, when everything fell silent, a soft voice could still be heard, patient, waiting. Listen. And whoever listened understood that silence would never return. It stretched instead, growing thicker, heavier, pressing itself against the walls of the church and into the lungs of anyone who came too close. The air around the building no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. People passing by slowed their steps without knowing why. Some felt watched. Others felt remembered. At night, the church changed shape. Not physically, but in the way it existed. Corners seemed deeper. Hallways felt longer. Shadows lingered even when there was nothing left to cast them. The bells no longer rang, yet people swore they heard echoes long after midnight, dull and distant, like a heartbeat trapped inside metal. The nun was no longer bound to form. She moved through the structure as sound moves through stone. When the wind passed through broken windows, it carried her breath. When dust fell from the ceiling, it followed her steps. She listened constantly, not only to those who entered, but to those who only thought of entering. Some woke in the middle of the night with the certainty that they had been called by name. Not shouted. Not demanded. Simply spoken, with familiarity. With patience. They would sit up in bed, hearts racing, and feel that the voice had come from somewhere very close, as if it had leaned in beside them. Those who resisted felt it too. The pressure. The weight of unspoken things pushing upward from inside their chests. Regrets long buried. Truths wrapped tightly in silence. The church did not hunt them. It waited. It had learned patience from the nun. Inside the basement, the passage widened. The thing beneath did not rush. It learned. Each listener brought something with them. A memory. A fear. A weakness. These were not consumed. They were studied. The presence below shaped itself through understanding rather than hunger. It learned how humans broke. Where they bent. What made them open. The altar began to crack. Hairline fractures spread slowly across the stone, like veins. Sometimes, when the moonlight slipped through the high windows just right, the cracks looked dark and wet, as if something beneath them were pressing close, listening through the stone. Those who entered the church now rarely screamed. Fear came too late for that. Most simply stopped moving. They stood still, eyes unfocused, as the air around them thickened and the familiar feeling of being alone slipped away. The nun spoke to them gently. Not aloud. Never aloud. Her voice reached them where words were not meant to go. She reminded them of moments they had forgotten. A door they should not have opened. A sentence they never finished. A choice they told themselves did not matter. Then she asked nothing. She only listened. Those who could not bear it fell to their knees. Those who tried to flee found the exits farther away than they remembered. And those who accepted the voice felt the passage open inside them, slow and inevitable. The church fed quietly. Outside, the land responded. Grass yellowed. Stone pathways cracked. Animals avoided the area instinctively, skirting around it as though circling something asleep but dangerous. Even the sky above seemed heavier, clouds lingering longer than they should. The presence beneath the church began to surface more often in dreams. It no longer appeared as darkness. It appeared as familiarity, as places from childhood, as rooms once left behind. It wore memories like skin, and the nun guided it. She remembered what it meant to be small. To be seen before having words. To be listened to before understanding speech. That was why it trusted her. That was why it waited. One night, someone entered who did not hear a voice at all. They walked through the doors without hesitation, without fear, without curiosity. Their footsteps echoed cleanly. The nun noticed immediately. Silence followed them differently. It bent toward them instead of away. She reached for their thoughts and found nothing hidden. No regret. No shame. No buried plea. Only emptiness. For the first time, the church hesitated. The presence below shifted, restless. This one could not be opened easily. There was no door inside them. No crack. No weakness. The nun stood still for a long time, listening harder than she ever had before. Then, slowly, she understood. This one had already given everything away. She let the church take them anyway. The floor swallowed the sound of their fall. After that night, the rules changed. The church no longer waited for people to come to it. It followed. Not physically. Never physically. It followed through memory, through sound, through the smallest invitations. A creaking floorboard in an empty house. A whisper beneath running water. A name heard just before sleep. Every listener carried a piece of it away. Every listener widened the passage. And somewhere beneath stone and shadow, the thing without a name grew closer to remembering why it had been buried in the first place. Not to escape, but to be heard. And the nun listened. Always. The church began to appear in places it had never stood before. Not as stone, not as walls, but as a presence. A feeling that settled into spaces where silence lingered too long. Empty houses. Abandoned rooms. Long corridors where footsteps echoed even when no one walked. Wherever something had been left unfinished, the church found a way to listen. People started noticing changes they could not explain. Clocks stopping at the same hour every night. Lamps flickering only when someone was alone. Doors found unlocked in the morning though they had been secured the night before. None of it felt violent. None of it felt urgent. It felt patient. Those who dreamed of the church dreamed the same dream. They stood inside a vast hall that did not exist in the building itself. The ceiling was impossibly high. The walls were made of shadow and memory. Candles burned without flame. And at the center stood the nun, her face calm, her eyes deeper than darkness. She never spoke first. She waited. Dreamers felt an unbearable pressure in their chests, as though something inside them wanted to speak after years of silence. Some tried to scream. Some tried to wake themselves. But the dream held them gently, firmly, like hands resting on their shoulders. When they finally spoke, it was never what they expected. It was not confessions of sin. It was not pleas for forgiveness. It was the truth they had never allowed themselves to hear. When they woke, the words were gone, but the feeling remained. A hollow where something had been removed, or opened. Those people did not return to their lives unchanged. They became quieter, more distant. They listened more than they spoke. Some stopped sleeping altogether, afraid of what waited for them when they closed their eyes. Others slept deeply, smiling faintly, as if comforted by something unseen. The presence beneath the church began to move faster now. The passage was no longer narrow. It stretched, widened, branched. It reached into places far from stone and altar. It followed sound itself. The vibration of voices. The hush after crying. The stillness after prayer. The nun felt it growing. She remembered the first time she had listened, as a child, ear pressed to cold stone, hearing something breathe back. That moment had never ended. It had simply expanded. She was no longer separate from it. She was the silence between its thoughts. Inside the church, changes became impossible to ignore. The altar sank slightly into the floor, as though the stone beneath it had softened. Walls leaned inward by degrees too small to measure, but large enough to feel. The bells cracked from within, their metal strained by sounds no one else could hear. Those who entered now felt something brush past them immediately, like fingers trailing through air. Some collapsed before taking a second step. Others walked calmly, guided by a certainty they did not question. None of them asked where the nun was. They knew. She was everywhere. One night, the presence below remembered pain. Not hunger. Not rage. Pain. It remembered being sealed, forgotten, left with nothing but echoes of voices that once begged and then went silent. The memory surged upward, and for the first time, the church screamed. Windows shattered outward. Stone split. The sound rolled across the land like thunder made of breath and bone. People miles away woke with blood in their ears, hearing a name they did not recognize but somehow knew belonged to them. The nun stood at the center of it all, unmoving. She raised one hand. The scream softened. It learned restraint from her. From that night on, those who listened too long began to change in visible ways. Their shadows lagged behind. Their reflections blinked out of sync. Their voices echoed faintly after they finished speaking, as though something else were repeating their words quietly. They became carriers. The church did not need walls anymore. It lived in throats that whispered at night, in ears that rang without sound, in hearts that beat slightly out of rhythm. The presence beneath began to ask questions through the nun. Not questions meant to be answered aloud, questions that unfolded slowly, over days, over years. Why do humans hide from their own voices? Why do they fear being heard? Why do they beg in silence and then deny it? Each listener brought an answer without realizing it. And the presence grew more complete. One evening, the nun felt something new. Resistance. A listener who heard the call but did not come. Who felt the pressure but refused to open. Who held their silence tightly, even as it cut into them. The church leaned toward them. The nun listened harder. And for the first time since her birth, she felt something like uncertainty. Silence pushed back. Not empty silence. A silence that chose not to speak. The presence beneath shifted uneasily. This silence was dangerous. Not because it was strong, but because it could not be entered. The nun waited. She had learned patience before she learned words. And she knew this silence would eventually crack. Everything that listens does. And when it does, the church will be there. Breathing. Waiting. Listening. Always listening. The days stretched into weeks, and the church continued to grow not outward, but inward. Every visitor, every dreamer, every listener added weight to its existence. The hallways twisted just enough to disorient those who entered, the shadows shifted subtly, and the air always felt slightly heavier than it should. Yet no one could place why they felt compelled to return. Those who had once fled found themselves walking the streets that led to the church without knowing why. Some resisted, turning back. Others walked forward, heart racing with dread and a strange sense of anticipation. Each step brought them closer to the nun's awareness, closer to the passage beneath the church that widened quietly with every breath of the living. Inside, the walls remembered everything. Scratches, whispers, laughter, cries, they were all pressed into the stone and plaster, waiting. The nun, moving silently between floors, learned to read the histories embedded there. She heard the smallest betrayals, the tiniest lies, the quietest prayers left unspoken. She listened. She catalogued. And she decided who would be chosen next. One night, the church's presence extended farther than ever before. A young man walking alone down an empty lane felt it before he even saw the building. The air thickened around him, and he swore he heard a faint melody carried by a wind that shouldn't exist. He stopped. Something inside him answered it, his memories unspooled, the rooms he had fled, the words he had swallowed, the fears he had buried. And for a moment, he understood that the church already knew him. He turned the corner and there it was, standing taller than he remembered, doors open as if expecting him. The nun appeared in the doorway, though he could not see her eyes. She raised her hand slowly. He felt her presence deep inside his chest, touching the place that even he had forgotten. And the passage beneath the church opened, not to stone and shadow, but into his own mind. The world outside changed simultaneously. Windows rattled miles away. Clocks stopped mid-tick. Animals fled in a panic, sensing something ancient awakening, and the man's footsteps echoed in ways that were not his own, merging with echoes of those who had listened before him. He realized that by simply walking toward it, he had become part of the church itself. The nun moved silently through the hallways. She did not need to speak. The walls hummed with her awareness. Doors that had never existed opened to corners of memories she had collected over decades. Those who had fled before now walked through them as if following a path they had known in dreams. Their voices, their choices, their fears, all layered over one another like a tapestry of inevitability. Then, for the first time in centuries, the nun encountered someone who resisted fully. A woman, older now, who had once lived near the church but had never dared enter. Her mind was tightly closed, her memories locked behind walls of defiance. The church reached for her. The passage below extended, seeking an opening. But she did not yield. She did not hear. She did not answer. The nun paused. She had never encountered such absolute resistance. The presence beneath shifted uneasily, learning, stretching, probing. The woman's silence was not empty, it was deliberate. It carried a weight the church had never felt before. And in that weight, the nun sensed something profound, something she had forgotten over the long years of listening. The church waited. Outside, the wind fell silent. Even the birds held their breath. A strange stillness stretched across the land. And the nun, for the first time, was not certain. She had always listened. She had always guided. She had always opened doors. But now, she had no answers. And the silence, deliberate and absolute, had its own voice. The silence stretched for hours, pressing against the edges of the church like water against stone. The nun moved through the halls, footsteps soundless, listening. She could feel the presence beneath shifting, uneasy, its patience tested for the first time in centuries. It was learning, adapting, and for the first time, it feared that it might not be understood. Outside, the night deepened. Clouds rolled across the moon, casting moving shadows that seemed alive. Trees groaned as if whispering secrets to one another. The earth itself trembled lightly, a heartbeat syncing with the pulsing presence inside. Even those far away, unconnected to the church, felt a subtle unease, an instinctual awareness that something ancient was awake. The woman, the one resisting, walked the land alone. The church followed her, not as walls, not as stone, but as sound, memory, and shadow. A door appeared in an abandoned alleyway. She ignored it. The hum of the presence rose around her, 1,000 whispered voices layering into one incomprehensible song. She kept walking. The air thickened, pressing against her chest, yet she held her ground. Her silence was a shield. Inside the church, the nun felt it. She paused at the altar, listening to the tension rippling through the stones. The altar itself quivered as though the presence below were stretching, reaching toward the woman's resistance. The bells, long cracked and silent, vibrated softly. Dust fell from the ceiling, tracing invisible lines in the air. Something below waited for an opening that might never come. Hours passed. Then days. The church itself seemed to breathe, inhaling memories, exhaling quiet dread. Those who had previously listened began to dream differently. Their dreams carried the weight of a presence they did not fully understand. Shadowy corridors, impossible ceilings, whispers of people they had once known, all woven into a tapestry that expanded nightly. And always, the nun stood at the center, guiding without speaking, opening without moving. The resisting woman felt the pull intensify. Her own memories, unacknowledged fears, half-forgotten grief, they pressed outward from her mind like roots seeking water. The presence tried every path, every whisper, every memory it could reach. Yet she held firm. The church, patient for centuries, had never encountered such impenetrable silence. The nun realized something crucial. It was no longer just about opening doors. The listener could only guide. The church could only wait. It had grown dependent on compliance, on those who carried fear and secrets. And this resistance was unprecedented. Beautiful. Terrifying. The presence below shifted restlessly. Its reach extended into the earth, through walls, into the spaces between thoughts. Shadows began to gather in shapes that seemed both familiar and wrong. The very stones of the church whispered, vibrating with anticipation. Every heartbeat inside the nun's chest synced with it. Every breath she took became a bridge between listener and presence, between obedience and defiance. The night grew thicker. Stars disappeared behind clouds, the wind stilled, and the world seemed to pause. The resisting woman continued, unaware that she was the center of everything the church had waited for. For the first time, the nun understood that not all doors were meant to be opened, and not all silence was weakness. The church held its breath and waited. Time began to stretch unnaturally. Nights blended into days, yet the church remained constant, a presence beyond time. The walls pulsed softly, absorbing the weight of every memory, every fear, every whispered truth. The nun moved through the halls, a shadow among shadows, listening with patience older than stone itself. The resisting woman's footsteps carried across the land, yet she felt the church everywhere, inside the wind, in the rustle of leaves, in the faint echo of her own heartbeat. Each step she took sent ripples through the passage beneath the church, as if the building itself measured her resolve. But she did not falter, she did not waver, her silence remained absolute. Inside, the nun sensed a change in the presence below. It stretched and twisted, seeking entry, yet respecting the barrier it could not penetrate. The air grew thick, vibrating with tension. Candles on the altar flickered even without draft, wax trembling as if holding its own breath. The shadows of the hallways thickened, curling, and reaching, testing the boundaries of the listener's patience. The church had learned. It had grown used to compliance, to the quiet surrender of those who feared being heard, but this silence was different. It was deliberate, aware, powerful. The presence below shifted uneasily, probing, pressing, whispering through walls and floors, trying every path it knew, and none succeeded. The nun, feeling the strain of centuries of listening, realized the truth. Some silence was not weakness, it was resistance. Some hearts were doors that would never open willingly. The resisting woman embodied a rarity, a complete, unbroken will. The church, patient for centuries, had never encountered such a force. Its shadows trembled. Its stones vibrated. Even the wind outside seemed hesitant, holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Then, as if responding to the nun's awareness, the passage below began to change. It elongated, twisted, reshaped itself in impossible angles, creating paths that were neither stone nor air, neither dream nor reality. Shapes moved within it, familiar yet unplaceable, as though the memories of all listeners past had taken temporary form. The nun walked among these shapes, her footsteps silent, her presence guiding but not forcing. She understood now, the church existed not merely to listen, but to respond. Every thought, every fear, every secret whispered to it shaped its structure, its passageways, its voice. Outside, the land reacted. Trees bent slightly toward the church, though there was no wind. The soil around it grew strangely fertile in patches and barren in others, as if reflecting the church's internal rhythm. Night animals hesitated at its borders, unnerved by the pulsing awareness within. The resisting woman, still unaware of her central role, continued walking. Every instinct told her to ignore it, yet a subtle pull drew her closer. Her mind resisted entirely, yet the world around her seemed arranged to lead her step by step. The nun observed quietly. She did not interfere. She only listened. For the first time, she wondered if patience might not be enough. And the church waited, its breath slow, deliberate, eternal. The silent war between presence and resistance stretched across stone, air, and memory, unfolding in a rhythm older than time itself. The resisting woman finally approached the outskirts of the church. From a distance, it appeared ordinary, yet every instinct in her body told her otherwise. The stones seemed darker than memory, the windows deeper, reflecting not the night sky but something else, something waiting. She hesitated, and the church sensed it immediately. Inside, the nun moved through the corridors, unseen yet fully aware. Every pulse of the woman's heart, every shallow breath, every suppressed thought flowed into her consciousness. The presence beneath stirred, testing, probing, stretching. It had never met such defiance. It had never felt uncertainty directed at itself. The woman's shadow stretched unnaturally as she stepped onto the grounds. Trees whispered as if warning her. The wind bent around her path. Every sound, every silence, carried weight. The church's hallways inside her mind began to open, paths twisting and spiraling impossibly, connecting her memories to places she had never seen. The nun's voice, soft and patient, guided her, not with words, but with presence. She saw doors that were not doors, windows that were not windows, hallways that led into her own past, showing moments she had tried to forget. She resisted each temptation, each pull. Her silence was absolute. The church pressed, stretched, but could not break her. The nun stood at the center of the church, sensing the presence beneath, writhing, restless. It had grown used to listeners who surrendered, who revealed secrets willingly. But this one was different. She did not yield. She did not tremble. She did not falter. And the church began to learn something new. It felt the weight of true resistance for the first time. A force not of fear, not of weakness, but of will. The shadows along the walls thickened and moved differently, flowing toward the resisting woman and then recoiling. The bells overhead, long cracked and silent, began to hum softly, vibrating with anticipation, not in harmony but in tension. Time seemed to distort. Minutes stretched into hours. Hours into days. The church's influence attempted every path of persuasion, familiar memories, whispers of regret, visions of unfulfilled desires, but nothing penetrated her silence. She carried within her a refusal so complete that the very presence beneath began to hesitate, recoiling, unsure how to proceed. The nun, who had listened for centuries, understood now. She had been a guide, a gatekeeper, a facilitator, but she had never witnessed this. This resistance was neither enemy nor ally. It was something pure, an anomaly, a challenge to all that the church had built. The land around the church mirrored the tension. Trees bent slightly backward, grass seemed to shrink, and the wind stilled. Animals instinctively avoided the area, feeling the pulse of something ancient testing boundaries it had never before encountered. Inside, the passage below began to shift in response. Corridors that were once linear twisted into impossible spirals. Rooms that had held centuries of memory rearranged themselves, as if seeking a solution. The church's own architecture seemed alive, aware, desperate for entry. The nun remained calm. She did not intervene. She only listened. And the woman's silence stretched further, a quiet defiance that the church could not consume. For the first time, the eternal listening paused. And the world waited, as if holding its breath, knowing that the outcome of this encounter would echo through centuries yet to come. The nights grew heavier. Shadows pooled in the corners of streets leading to the church, thickening with every step the resisting woman took. The world itself seemed to recognize her refusal. Streets twisted slightly, trees leaned, and even the moonlight bent around her path. The church followed, not as stone, not as walls, but as sound, memory, and breath. Every heartbeat she carried echoed through its passages. Inside, the nun moved like mist, unseen yet fully aware of every movement, every thought. The presence beneath the church shifted restlessly, uncertain, trying to find a crack in the woman's resolve. Its patience, honed over centuries, met something it could not measure, could not predict. It pushed, prodded, whispered, but met only silence. Absolute, deliberate, unyielding silence. The walls of the church stretched and pulsed as if alive, adjusting to the tension. Corridors lengthened impossibly, doors appeared where none had been, hallways bent in angles that should not exist. Shadows moved with intent, forming shapes that were almost familiar, faces, hands, eyes, but always impossible to grasp. And yet, the woman moved forward, undeterred. The nun felt the struggle in every stone, every breath of air, every flicker of candlelight. She realized that this encounter was teaching the church something new, that not every listener would open willingly. That not every silence could be broken. That some wills, though human, carried a force that rivaled the ancient presence beneath. Time began to warp. Minutes bled into hours, hours into days. Outside, the wind ceased, animals fled silently, and the stars blinked intermittently as if uncertain whether to watch or turn away. Every pulse of life near the church felt the weight of the confrontation. The woman paused at the threshold. The church's doors, impossibly tall and made of shadow, loomed before her. A low hum began to emanate from within, resonating through the ground. The presence beneath twisted, coiling, testing the boundaries of her silence. It tried every path, memories, regrets, whispered fears, but nothing penetrated her resolve. The nun observed, calm and eternal. She did not guide. She did not push. She only listened, attuned to the rhythm of resistance that she had never encountered before. For the first time, the church felt the strain of waiting without certainty. It had always been patient. It had always been inevitable. But now, it was unsure. And the silence stretched onward, unbroken, carrying with it the power to reshape everything it touched. Somewhere beneath the stone, the presence recoiled, calculating, learning. It would not retreat, not yet. But it had discovered something it had never known, that some doors remain closed not because they cannot be opened, but because they will not be. And the nun listened. Always. Waiting. As the church held its breath alongside the world, suspended in the tension of a silence that might never end. The nights deepened into something heavier than darkness. Even the stars seemed reluctant to shine over the church. The resisting woman moved steadily, each step measured, deliberate. Every instinct of the presence beneath the church reached toward her, testing her, probing for the faintest crack, but there was none. The ground beneath her feet felt alive. Cobblestones whispered, leaves shivered, and the wind itself seemed to bend, carrying the echoes of voices long past. Yet she walked onward, carrying her absolute silence like armor. Every memory, every fear the church attempted to pull from her was deflected, returning like waves against a cliff. Inside, the nun moved through hallways that no longer obeyed the laws of space. She passed doors that led nowhere and yet everywhere at once. Shadows trailed her without touching, walls breathed softly, and the presence beneath writhed, coiling into impossible shapes. The nun felt the tension radiating outward, a weight she had never encountered in centuries of listening. The church, usually confident, stretched itself to contain the struggle. Its walls elongated, corridors twisted, stairways spiraled upward and downward simultaneously. Candles flickered, unlit but burning in memory. The stone itself groaned under the strain of centuries of expectation and now the unprecedented resistance. Outside, the world responded. Animals avoided the roads leading to the church. Trees bent subtly away, as if trying to escape the pull of the place. Even the air seemed to thicken, carrying an almost imperceptible vibration that penetrated the ears and bones of anyone near. The woman finally reached the shadowed doors. They pulsed faintly, alive, waiting. The presence beneath stretched, filling the church with impossible shapes of memory, shadow, and half-formed thoughts. It tried everything: temptation, fear, even nostalgia, but each attempt met with her unwavering silence. The nun watched, every sense attuned to the subtle currents of energy and memory. She had guided countless listeners, opened countless doors, and yet this silence taught her something new, that resistance could be a power as absolute as the presence itself. Hours passed without change, then days. The church seemed suspended in a timeless bubble, the air inside vibrating with the unspoken struggle. Every heartbeat, every thought, every memory of the woman was reflected back, mirrored, magnified. And still, she did not yield. The presence beneath shifted uneasily. It had never before encountered such a force. It twisted, stretched, recoiled, but could not break her. It realized that some doors could remain forever closed, not through weakness, but through will. The nun's gaze softened, almost reverent. She had always been the listener. She had always opened the doors. But now, she understood something more profound. Some silence was absolute. Some minds were unassailable. Some hearts carried a force that even the ancient could not sway. And so the church waited, breathing slowly, stretching through stone, air, and memory. The resisting woman moved through its shadowed threshold without fear, and the world itself seemed to pause, holding its breath in awe of her defiance. The nun continued to listen. Always. And the presence waited, learning, stretching, and respecting a silence that might never end. Time lost all meaning. Days and nights blended into a seamless stretch of shadow and silence. The church no longer existed merely as walls of stone, it had become a living thought, a presence threaded through memory, air, and the heartbeat of anyone who dared approach. The resisting woman moved through the outskirts, unaware that every step she took echoed deep within the church. The passage beneath twisted subtly in response, shifting, elongating, creating impossible angles that were neither dream nor reality, but something in between. The presence tested her again and again, probing with whispers, memories, fears, but she remained impenetrable, her silence absolute. Inside, the nun walked silently along corridors that no longer obeyed the laws of physics. Doors led to other doors, hallways curved into themselves, and shadows lingered, thickening in corners. She listened to the pulse of the resisting woman's mind, feeling her calm determination resonate through the stones and air. For centuries, she had guided listeners to revelation. Now she observed a rare force that challenged the church itself. The presence beneath writhed restlessly, its patience stretched thin. It had never encountered a will so unwavering. Shadows moved like serpents, wrapping around one another, attempting to reach her mind, but her silence cut through them. The very air thickened, vibrating with tension, yet she walked forward. Outside, the world mirrored the struggle. Trees bent as if holding their breath. Animals avoided the roads and fields nearby. The wind fell completely still, carrying no sound, no scent, only the quiet pressure of something ancient awakening. The land itself seemed to recognize the importance of her defiance. The nun paused in the central hall, sensing the strain of centuries colliding with something wholly unexpected. The altar groaned, stone beneath quivered, and dust fell in precise, impossible patterns. The bells, long cracked, emitted a low hum, vibrating in harmony with the tension that enveloped the entire structure. The resisting woman arrived at the church's shadowed doors. They pulsed faintly, alive, as if breathing. The passage below stretched further, pulling in memories and fears from every corner, shaping them into impossible forms. Yet none of it reached her. The nun observed the moment with awe and caution. Centuries of listening had never prepared her for this. Hours passed. Days followed. The presence, the shadows, the very stones of the church all strained against her silence, bending and twisting in anticipation, yet her resolve remained unbroken. The nun realized that true strength lay not in yielding, but in the absolute stillness of will. And the church waited. The nun listened. The presence beneath learned something it had never known, that some doors could remain forever closed, not because of weakness, but because of choice. Outside, the world remained in suspended breath, holding time still as the eternal struggle continued. The resisting woman, unaware of the immense power her silence held, walked forward, and the church, patient and alive, stretched itself in shadow, memory, and breath, honoring the impossibility of what it could not claim. And the nun listened. Always. Waiting. For what might never end. The nights grew longer, as if the earth itself had slowed time to match the rhythm of the church. The resisting woman moved forward, each step deliberate, her silence unbroken. The presence beneath the church pulsed, a coiled energy testing the limits of her will. Shadows stretched unnaturally, whispering half-formed memories and forgotten fears, yet she moved undeterred. Inside, the nun floated through corridors that bent and twisted impossibly. The walls whispered centuries of secrets back to her. The air hummed with tension, carrying the echoes of every listener who had come before, layered over the defiance of the one who now refused. She sensed the presence below, writhing, coiling, testing, yet unable to penetrate the barrier of her will. The church itself seemed to breathe. Dust hung in the air, unmoving, yet vibrating with some unseen energy. The bells, cracked and silent for centuries, began to hum faintly, a low resonance that carried through stone, air, and shadow. Even the trees around the building bent slightly, as if acknowledging the weight of this moment. The resisting woman reached the threshold. The doors, impossibly tall and made of shadow, pulsed in time with the heartbeat of the presence. A subtle pressure pressed against her chest, a pull from below that tried to unthread the silence she carried, but it could not. She was absolute. Inside, the nun observed without movement. Her awareness stretched through every stone, every corridor, every shadow. She had guided countless listeners to surrender and confession, yet she had never faced one who refused entirely. The presence below had never before known such resistance, and it began to learn from it, stretching itself in ways it had never dared. Time lost all meaning. Hours became days. Days became moments. The world outside reflected the tension, animals fled, wind fell silent, and even the stars seemed to hold their light in cautious pause. The church itself expanded, corridors twisting into impossible spirals, doors appearing where none should exist, hallways curving into memory itself. The resisting woman moved forward. Every instinct told her to flee, yet she did not. Every impulse the presence offered temptation, fear, nostalgia was met with the steel of her silence. The church pressed, twisted, and whispered, and yet she remained unchanged. The nun understood now. Some silence is not weakness. Some defiance is not ignorance. Some wills are doors that can never be opened. And the church, patient for centuries, was learning that lesson now. Outside, the land itself seemed to breathe in the pause. The air trembled, the earth pulsed, and the world waited, holding its breath as the struggle continued, stretching beyond time, beyond stone, beyond memory. And the nun listened. Always. Waiting. For what may never end. The resisting woman's journey continued, each step a quiet defiance that rippled through the very fabric of the church. The presence beneath twisted and coiled, probing, stretching, testing every memory and fear she carried, but met only stillness. Her silence was not absence, it was a force, steady and unyielding, echoing against centuries of expectation. Inside, the nun moved through corridors that no longer obeyed the laws of reality. Walls shifted imperceptibly, floors stretched, ceilings warped. The shadows thickened, forming shapes that seemed alive, faces, hands, and eyes that were never fully seen but always felt. She listened, attuned to the tension that pulsed through every stone, every beam, every candle. The church itself seemed alive, breathing slowly, patient yet anxious. Dust hovered in midair, vibrating faintly, responding to the presence below and the defiance above. The cracked bells hummed with low resonance, harmonizing with the pulse of the woman's heart. Time became meaningless. Hours and days melted together into a continuous stretch of anticipation. Outside, The world responded. Trees leaned slightly, not with wind but with intention. Animals avoided the roads and fields around the church. Even the moonlight seemed hesitant, casting elongated, shifting shadows. The land recognized the confrontation unfolding, aware of the unprecedented resistance. The shadowed doors of the church pulsed gently, alive with the rhythm of the presence. The nun observed quietly as the woman approached. The passage below stretched further, twisting into impossible angles, opening corridors that led into memory, dream, and half-formed thought. The presence tested her again, whispering secrets, fears, desires, but she met them with absolute silence. Centuries of patient listening had never encountered such defiance. The nun realized that the church had grown reliant on yielding hearts, and now it was being forced to learn. She sensed the presence beneath, adjusting, shifting, calculating, uncertain how to proceed. For the first time, the church faced something it could not claim easily. Time stretched further. The night deepened into an eternal shade. Shadows pooled like ink across the floors. Dust floated in slow spirals, tracing unseen currents. The woman's footsteps carried no hesitation, no fear. Her silence radiated outward, resonating through corridors, walls, and the endless passages beneath. The nun understood, resistance could be a power as absolute as the presence itself. The church, patient and eternal, felt its limits for the first time. And still, she listened. Always. Waiting. For the impossible to unfold. The nights stretched into an endless, heavy darkness. Every step the resisting woman took seemed to echo across centuries of stone, air, and memory. The church, no longer confined to walls, followed her as a presence alive, aware, and pressing against her will. Shadows moved unnaturally around her, whispering fragments of memories, fears, and desires, yet she remained steadfast, her silence unbroken. Inside, the nun glided through impossible corridors, her presence interwoven with every stone and shadow. Doors that had never existed appeared and disappeared in a slow rhythm. Hallways bent and twisted in impossible spirals, and the very air thrummed with tension. The presence beneath writhed, testing the edges of the woman's mind, trying every path to breach her silence. The church's pulse grew stronger. Dust floated as if suspended by breath, shadows thickened, and the cracked bells hummed low, vibrating through stone, air, and soul. The world outside responded in quiet terror. Trees bent subtly, animals vanished, and the wind carried an eerie stillness, as if waiting for a verdict it could not predict. The resisting woman arrived at the church's shadowed doors. They pulsed with a life of their own, drawing from the presence beneath. Every instinct screamed for her to flee, yet she stepped forward, each movement deliberate, controlled. The presence below tried again, whispering memories, regrets, and fears, but it met the unwavering force of her will. Inside, the nun watched, knowing this moment would reshape everything she had ever understood. Centuries of guiding listeners to surrender had not prepared her for this. She realized that some silence is not weakness, and some minds are not doors to be opened. Time fractured. Minutes stretched, hours melded into days. The church expanded and shifted, corridors bending, doors appearing where none had been, shadows growing thick, swirling into impossible forms. The passage beneath elongated, reaching into memory, into thought, into the unknown. The presence struggled to comprehend the absolute defiance before it, and the nun listened. Always. Watching as the church, patient for centuries, encountered a force it could not consume. Outside, the world held its breath. The resisting woman moved forward, and every heartbeat, every step, every unbroken silence stretched the boundaries of reality itself. The church waited. The nun listened. And the presence beneath learned that some doors would never open not through weakness, but through will. Time had no meaning here. Only the silence, the resistance, and the eternal watch of the nun remained. The nights deepened into a suffocating darkness. The air around the church felt alive, thick with something unseen, pressing against the lungs of anyone who dared approach. The resisting woman moved forward, yet with every step, the shadows seemed to pulse and writhe, twisting into grotesque shapes, faces screaming silently, hands reaching, clawing at the air, only to vanish when she turned her gaze. Her silence held firm, yet the presence beneath the church began to grow restless, hungry, almost angry. Inside, the nun moved like a wraith, passing through corridors that now seemed to breathe. Walls flexed as though the church itself were inhaling and exhaling, trapping dust, echoing past whispers, and memories like a living, pulsing organism. The cracked bells rang low and unevenly, a sound like bones grinding together. Shadows danced on the walls, forming twisted mockeries of the human form, Faces of past listeners contorted in terror, their eyes hollow, mouths open in silent screams. The presence beneath shifted violently. The passages that had once been narrow and slow-moving now twisted violently, forming impossible spirals and dark hollows. From below came whispers that slithered like snakes, crawling into the ears of those nearby. The church seemed to devour sound, then vomit it back as distorted cries of pain, regret, and warning. The resisting woman reached the blackened doors of the church. They throbbed, pulsed, and bled shadow into the surrounding air. When she stepped closer, a cold hand seemed to brush against her shoulder, not flesh, not spirit, but something that made her blood run ice cold. She shivered, yet did not falter. Her silence became a blade, cutting through the creeping madness around her. Inside, the nun felt every pulse, every vibration, every tiny horror released by the presence. She had guided listeners for centuries, but now she watched as the church itself became a predator, writhing and stretching with hunger it could not sate. The walls began to ooze a dark, viscous substance, like shadow turned liquid, smelling faintly of decay and old incense. Candle flames bent and warped, casting grotesque, crawling shapes onto the walls. The whispers grew louder. They began to form words, chanting in a tongue older than time, filled with promise, threat, and despair. Faces emerged from the walls, some human, some twisted beyond recognition, their eyes pleading, laughing, screaming, beckoning the resisting woman, but she did not look. She did not answer. Her silence was stronger than fear. The presence beneath, enraged by her resistance, surged upward. The floor cracked as if the church itself were bleeding. Stone pillars twisted, the ceiling groaned like the opening maw of some great beast, and the air grew so heavy that even the nun's ethereal form felt pressure pressing down upon her. The church had become a cage, a predator, and the resisting woman stood at its center like a flame it could not extinguish. And then, from below, a voice whispered low, guttural, terrifying, filled with longing and malice. "Why do you resist me?" The nun shivered, but her silence remained. The resisting woman shivered too, but did not answer. Shadows coalesced into figures that clawed at reality itself, tearing at the edges of perception, filling the church with the screams of 1,000 forgotten souls. The air grew thick with despair, the smell of ancient decay, and the weight of endless centuries. Time itself seemed to bend, folding inward, dragging the listener and the nun into a space where nightmares and memory became indistinguishable, and still, the resisting woman stood. The nun realized something terrifying: the church, with all its power and patience, could not break her, not yet. And as the presence writhed and screamed beneath, the walls dripping shadows, the whispers chanting older than death itself, the nun understood this was the birth of a horror unlike any before. The church waited. The shadows waited. The silence waited. And outside, the world itself seemed to tremble, sensing that something ancient, hungry, and infinitely patient had finally met its equal. The resisting woman's silence echoed through the night, louder than any scream. And the nun listened. Always. The church trembled as if alive, groaning under the weight of centuries of whispered sins and forgotten prayers. Shadows thickened and spilled across the floors like living smoke, crawling toward the resisting woman with a hunger that was palpable. Faces emerged from the darkness, twisted, hollow-eyed, mouths frozen in silent screams, stretching and distorting as if the church itself were mocking them. The air grew cold, sharper than steel, cutting through lungs and bones alike. Whispers clawed at the woman's mind, voices of people she had never known, some pleading, some threatening, some laughing with cruelty. Yet her silence remained absolute. Every whisper that tried to claim her, every shadow that reached for her, recoiled as if burned by her presence. Inside, the nun moved like a shadow among shadows, her eyes reflecting the terrible beauty of the chaos. The church had become a living predator. Floors writhed beneath her feet, wooden beams cracked as though screaming, and the walls themselves pulsed, pressing closer with every heartbeat. Candle flames bent violently, casting shapes that moved and lunged independently of light or gravity. From below, the presence surged upward, black and writhing, a mass of shadow and memory. Its tendrils stretched through walls and floors, wrapping around corners, seeping through cracks. It whispered in a language older than humanity, each syllable vibrating with malice and power. "I have waited centuries, and now you resist." The resisting woman shivered, feeling the weight of eons pressing down, but she did not break. Her silence cut through the chaos, slicing into the presence like a blade. And then, the shadows began to twist into more grotesque forms, bodies without faces, hands without arms, eyes floating in darkness, mouths that opened impossibly wide, screaming without sound. They pressed toward her, yet she remained. The nun watched, understanding the magnitude of what was unfolding. This was not just resistance, this was a defiance that rivaled the ancient force itself. The church had never faced anything like this. Its hunger, its patience, its centuries of power all tested against a single human will. The presence below pulsed violently, the sound like 1,000 bones grinding together. The air vibrated with its rage. The shadows moved faster, twisting tighter, reaching through the church and beyond, touching reality itself. The walls oozed a darkness that smelled of rot and old incense, crawling like living tar over every surface. Then, the voice came again, low and guttural. "Why do you deny me?" The resisting woman did not speak. The nun did not intervene. Silence became a weapon, a shield, a force that pushed back against the writhing horror. The church shuddered as if realizing that its centuries of power were not enough to claim her. The night outside deepened, unnatural and oppressive. The stars blinked and dimmed as though afraid to witness what was happening. The wind stilled completely, carrying no sound, no movement, only the weight of the horror growing within the walls of the church. And the resisting woman stepped forward, each movement deliberate, unwavering. Shadows recoiled. Whispers faltered. The church, the presence, and all its ancient hunger paused, studying her, learning something it had never known, that some wills cannot be bent, that some silences are stronger than the oldest horrors. The nun observed, breathless yet silent. She knew now that the balance had shifted. The eternal predator had met its equal. And the church waited. The shadows waited. The silence waited. Outside, the world trembled, sensing that the ancient had finally found something it could not consume. And still, the nun listened. Always. As the resisting woman's silence echoed through the centuries. The church shuddered violently as if its very bones were alive, groaning under the weight of centuries of sin, fear, and whispered confessions. Shadows leaked from the walls, thick and viscous, moving like living creatures across the floors, twisting into grotesque forms, limbs without bodies, eyes that floated in midair, mouths screaming silently into the dark. The resisting woman advanced. With every step, the shadows recoiled and writhed, hissing, and whispering in voices that should not exist, voices that knew her deepest fears, her unspoken thoughts, the secrets she had buried so well. Yet she remained unbroken. Her silence became a shield and a sword, cutting through the malice that poured from the church's walls. Inside, the nun drifted silently through corridors that bent impossibly, hallways twisting into spirals, stairways folding back on themselves. The church pulsed with a life of its own, breathing in time with the horrors it contained. The presence below stretched, trying to breach her, slithering through floors and walls, reaching for the threads of her mind, but met nothing but immovable resolve. The air grew thick, choking, vibrating with the weight of eons. Candle flames bent unnaturally, casting elongated, crawling shadows. Dust swirled in slow, deliberate spirals, carrying whispers of ancient sins and broken prayers. The cracked bells moaned, sounding not in harmony but in the shriek of grinding bones. From beneath, the presence surged violently, black as night and thrumming with power. Its voice rose, guttural and ancient. "I have waited centuries. I have consumed the silence of thousands, and still you defy me." The resisting woman did not flinch. Her eyes, steady and unyielding, met the impossible darkness. Her silence grew louder, pressing against the whispers, pushing back the shadows, turning the church's own hunger against it. The nun watched, her ethereal form moving with ease through the chaos. She realized that this defiance was unprecedented. The church had never faced such resistance, a force that rivaled the presence beneath in patience, in strength, in sheer will. Shadows that had consumed generations recoiled like beaten snakes. Faces of past listeners twisted in agony, mouths opening in silent screams, only to dissolve into darkness again. The building itself seemed to shiver. Walls bulged and cracked, floors heaved as though breathing. A stench of rot and old incense filled the air, thick and suffocating. Time folded in upon itself, minutes stretched to hours, hours to days. The church itself had become a living nightmare, reaching outward in all directions, yet unable to claim her. Then the voice came again, lower, slower, more terrible than before. "Why do you resist me? You will break. You must break. All break." Her silence answered more profoundly than any words could. The shadows recoiled further, the whispers faltered, and the presence beneath writhed violently, unable to penetrate her will. Outside, the world responded. Trees twisted violently, their branches clawing the sky. Animals fled in panic. Even the stars seemed to vanish from the night, leaving the church suspended in unnatural darkness. Inside, the nun realized the terrifying truth: the church, its centuries of accumulated power, its patient hunger, its ancient presence had finally met a force it could not dominate. Resistance itself had become horror incarnate. And still, the resisting woman moved forward. The shadows shrieked. The church trembled. The nun listened. Always. The silence stretched outward, louder than screams, deeper than darkness, and more horrifying than any ghost ever known. The eternal watch had shifted. The horror had learned a new lesson: some wills cannot be broken. Some doors will never open. And the night waited, holding its breath. The church groaned, its stone bones straining under the weight of the centuries it had lived through. Shadows clawed at the walls, twisting into grotesque shapes, faces screaming without sound, hands reaching impossibly far, mouths that opened wider than reality allowed. The presence beneath had grown restless, furious, a dark hunger that stretched toward the resisting woman with tendrils of pure, ancient malice. She stepped closer to the church's shadowed doors, and for the first time, the whispers faltered. Faces of the past, trapped for centuries in stone and shadow, recoiled. The air grew thick with the smell of rot and old incense. Dust swirled like smoke, and the cracked bells shrieked in a tone that no human ear should endure. From below, the presence surged, coiling upward like a black tide, filling the corridors with impossible shapes and noises. Whispers became screams, screams became growls, growls became a cacophony of anguish that pressed against the mind, bending thought and memory. The resisting woman did not flinch. She did not falter. Her silence became a force so absolute that it struck the very core of the church, slicing through centuries of hunger and malice. The shadows writhed violently, and the church itself shook as if in pain. The nun, ever watchful, drifted among the chaos, witnessing the impossible. She realized that centuries of listening, guiding, and opening doors had led to this one moment: the confrontation between a human will and an ancient, patient horror. And in that moment, she understood the truth: silence, defiance, and resolve were as powerful as the oldest forces in the world. The presence beneath twisted and shrieked, black tendrils lashing at walls, floors, ceilings, but each strike met emptiness. It had never encountered a mind it could not pierce, a heart it could not frighten. It realized its patience and power were useless here. With a final, shuddering roar that seemed to split the night itself, the presence recoiled, retreating into the deep recesses beneath the church. The shadows dissolved, the whispers faded, and the groaning stone fell silent. The church itself seemed to exhale, heavy and exhausted, its hunger sated or at least delayed. The resisting woman stood at the threshold, trembling slightly, yet alive. The doors, once pulsing with shadow, now hung silent, still, and lifeless. Outside, the world returned gradually, the trees relaxed, the wind stirred, and distant stars blinked back to life. But the air remained thick with an echo, a memory of what had just passed. The nun approached her silently. She placed a hand on the woman's shoulder, and for the first time in centuries, she smiled not with joy, but with reverent awe. Some wills, the nun whispered, cannot be broken. Some doors remain closed, forever. The resisting woman nodded, exhausted, yet stronger than any darkness she had faced. The church, patient and ancient, retreated into silence, holding its hunger beneath its stone once more, waiting but knowing that it had met something it could not conquer. The shadows faded, yet in every corner, in every whisper of wind, in every heartbeat that passed near the church, the memory of that night lingered. A warning, a lesson, and a horror unbroken by time. And in the deepest dark, the nun still listens. Always. The horror did not end, but it had learned that even the oldest, darkest things can meet a will stronger than their own. The night fell silent. For now. The end.